Welcome to Security AF Podcast. I'll be hosting this episode. I'm Keelan Knox, and joining me is Bryan. I'm going to let Bryan introduce himself and pretty much just a little bit backstory about who you are, what you do in the security space.
Beautiful. Thanks, Keelan. I'm happy to be here, so appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Bryan Filice with Armorpoint, technical account manager, and Armorpoint is a managed SIM and SOC provider, as well as cybersecurity firm.
Mm-hmm.
We partnered with Alias as well as several other partners in the space to help bring our platform to our clients. I have a couple years of technical sales under my belt, and prior to that, I've been in service delivery and service operations for about 8 years for an MSP out of Northern California. So
That's awesome, man.
yeah.
I myself, I've been in this space for a little over 2 years now, and it's fascinating to see how much has changed just from the time I started to now. Have you seen a lot of change yourself being in your role, especially in technical sales?
Rapid evolution,
Really?
particularly in cybersecurity. So if we were to rewind 5 years ago, cybersecurity was not the buzzword that it is today in my mind, or at least what I was seeing. It was very much, hey, do you have endpoint protection on your devices? And if you do, and your firewalls are in place, then you're doing great, right? And it's the landscape, just what breaches and ransomware have done have caused us to have to really be forward thinking in terms of our security. And so I feel like if you blink, you miss something, and there's new companies, new software, new services, and so it takes everything to stay on top of it, and so it's fun.
It kind of like leads me into the direction of our conversation here today. I wanted to talk more about from your perspective, operating in as technical sales for Armorpoint. What does a security operations look like from Armorpoint, from where you're employed and with the work that you do, and how that translates over into the customers you serve in terms of their security operations? What are some of those key differences that you notice?
Yeah, so I would say from the Armorpoint standpoint, our platform and offering was built from a SOC analyst perspective.
Gotcha.
And so our chief information security officer actually saw a void. We used to use FortiSIM from a platform perspective, and there was a gap in terms of functionality, visibility, and really efficiency and speed to address alerts and events as they came in. And so we see that as a common issue that organizations face. They have alert fatigue, or you have events and alerts that are going into a mailbox, and you've got a distribution list, and there's not really a process for, hey, of the 5 people on your IT team, who's jumping on those and how do you address them? And what if someone marks that email read and nobody does anything with it? So really the idea behind Armorpoint, it was built from the SOC analyst to be able to offer it to our customers and say, hey, this is from a transparent perspective, not only internally from the SOC perspective, but from the customer perspective. You can see when an alert generates, who it gets assigned to, how long it's been open. From an SLA perspective, hey, have we met that SLA in terms of investigation and response? And so that was really the goal behind it, was transparency and speed to be able to address those events, because we all know when it comes to security, urgency and speed is paramount. If you can't get ahead of that, then that spread can be very bad.
I agree. So I feel like a lot of SOC analysts or security analysts can get caught in the weeds of all those alerts and so forth. What can, organizations or businesses do to, better protect themselves if they don't have a SOC? And what does that look like in terms of what sort of tools are out there that can actually help them in terms of providing them a level of visibility similar to a SOC, but also still create that posture for them?
It's a great question. And truthfully, there are countless platforms out there now. And so it's not really about which one's better. It's more so about, hey, can you, from a customer perspective, what are you able to get out there and actually fully implement. Because what we often see is the implementation stalls out, or it becomes stagnant, or there's no process in place. As an example, maybe you do your initial implementation, but over time you roll out new endpoints and you make changes, and then if there's not a process in place to put protection on the new devices, now all of a sudden you have devices out in the wild and they have no protection whatsoever. And so we see that commonly happening. And truthfully, not every organization needs a SOC or a security operations center or a SIM. SIM typically is, the driver for that is often regulatory or some sort of compliance, and hey, we need to retain our logs for a period of time. So not every organization, especially when you're talking 20, 30, 50 users, and they're not in a highly regulated industry, what I would just recommend from a very basic level is you've got your endpoint protection. So ideally you have some sort of a next gen or an EDR in place that's going to be able to take some sort of automation in play. So you have isolation and containment that those tools can perform, so that any potential malicious files are stopped in their tracks. And you don't have to have human intervention. Of course, firewalls, perimeter firewalls with IPS and IDS signatures that get updated, devices that get patched. Patch management is huge. And
it's very huge.
And it's amazing. And this is where I think it's so challenging for organizations to stay ahead of everything, is because you hear all these buzzwords and you hear about breaches and this and that. And so, we got to make sure we have a SIM or this and that. But then you forget to patch your devices, and all of a sudden it's well, now you just left the front door of your house open, and no wonder somebody got in. And email security is huge. Obviously, we do so much over email. So having a effective spam filtering tool in place is key. And then the thing that I think we all know in this space is that, we're all human. We all make mistakes. We click an email or go to a link or a website that we shouldn't have gone to. And so that human training is huge. Having a platform and an ongoing training, not only when they're hired, but, maybe even quarterly. And then phishing campaigns, because phishing is rampant now. The education of the user is so important.
I agree. It is very important, and it's a never-ending and constant process or engagement, rather. Right, to where you can't pretty much perform just a one-off test or simulation with end users, because that one-off, they'll learn the lesson then, but then what happens whenever that same simulation becomes more sophisticated, but it's an actual, real, active attack or threat.
Absolutely. And it's becoming these threat actors, and who knows how much of this is driven by AI, and you've got bots starting the process for them. But so much is what we're seeing a lot of, LinkedIn. So you've got new users that start at a new company. They update their LinkedIn and say, hey, I've started at XYZ company. And all of a sudden, now they're getting text messages or emails that are from the CEO or somebody. And so you've got a new employee who's eager and they want to perform and they want to do well. And then they get a text message that's presumptively from the CEO, and they want to jump on it. They want to do it. So now they go and buy gift cards or whatever it is. And so you hear about these stories, and people shouldn't be embarrassed. It's just about organizations putting a program and a process in place and then aligning to that process. So, it's not enough to put a policy in place. If you don't have a procedure to enforce that policy, then it goes out the window, right? People forget.
It kind of leads me into another question that I have for you. Why is it so important for organizations to keep up to date and monitor vulnerabilities that exist in their environment? And then also, what are some key ways that they can actually go about doing that and implementing that within their process?
Yeah, it's a good question. It seems like every day there's some sort of new vulnerability, not necessarily a 0-day vulnerability, but there's a vulnerability on a firewall platform or on a server or something like that. And So having a solid vulnerability management program in place, and it can be very basic, but
Right.
just stick to the basics of patch management on a regular basis, making sure that your servers, your workstations are patched, making sure that your network devices get patched. Not to say that anybody needs to be bleeding edge, but having a process in place for that. There's also feeds that organizations could subscribe to make sure that they're getting notified as there's new vulnerabilities in the wild. And then, truthfully, each organization that has any kind of significant infrastructure should have some type of vulnerability scanning program happening. Right. So, and it's so cost effective to outsource those things now, but it has to go beyond the scan, right?
I agree.
Perform the scan, and then, oh, hey, I got my report. I'm done. Well,
instead of just taking that report and just putting it in the drawer somewhere and only looking at it one time.
That's the checkbox, right?
I feel like those vulnerability scans, including like those reports, should be used as a roadmap in order to basically address what's pre-existing, what needs to be mitigated, and then from there, retesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You rescan, you make sure that you got it. And, I think the thing that's challenging for organizations is they get a vulnerability scan report, and depending on the size of your infrastructure, it could be 40, 80 pages, and then they don't know where to start.
Right.
And that's where, if they don't have that resource or skill set in-house, that's something that would be pertinent to outsource and get somebody in there that can help them, even just on a consultancy basis, and say, hey, let's go through this. Let's put together a vulnerability management program for you, and let's risk rank your assets, essentially.
Right.
Because you may get a vulnerability in your environment, but maybe that asset that vulnerability on is not like pertinent to your environment. Maybe it can't access anything that's important. So you now had your team go and focus on this, but really you have this item that's lower on the CVE or CVSS score. That's the issue. And so having a real good understanding of where everything is, ensuring that you're doing regular scans, and then from that scan, how are we addressing it? How are we patching it? And then, to your point, rescanning and validating that, we got to trust but verify, right?
I believe if the scans are being outsourced to, let's say, a third party, I find it very valuable and significant if those vendors are, when they provide those reports, they're also providing steps for remediation on how to address those vulnerabilities. What's unique is, I feel like in our reporting process here at Alias, is how we try to address, or at least make it easier for our customers to prioritize which vulnerabilities to address first,
right,
based on severity.
I agree completely, because sometimes organizations don't know, and then what you get that, oh shoot, I don't know where to start, so I'm just not going to start. It's not where you want to be at all. Right?
Not at all.
and oftentimes it's maybe there's a front-loaded effort where there is a fairly significant upfront cost to get that program in place, get that process running. But once it's fleshed out, then you have to your point, a roadmap to go and, hey, how do we address this month over month, week over week, and chip away at it? And once they've gotten their environment in a good state, then really you're just in a maintenance mode, right? Then you're not doing 10, 20 hours of patching and everything. You just...
I agree.
Yeah.
From your perspective, how would you define the key differences between vulnerability assessment or scanning versus penetration testing, and what's the benefits of an organization implementing each one of those types of tests?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So at a basic level, the vulnerability scan has to be there to make sure that you have kind of an understanding of where everything's at, and really that's the foundation of the penetration test.
Right.
So penetration testing, most organizations don't need to do that on a monthly basis, but if you have I have a customer as an example who recently refreshed their firewalls and they updated the configuration, that's a perfect time afterwards to perform a scan and do a pen test on those firewalls, because you want to ensure that they're secure. Oftentimes you hear, hey, I've got an annual requirement. I need to perform a pen test. Okay, great. That's wonderful. So much changes in a year. So much changes.
So much.
So I think it's important to do both, and there's ways to do both in a very cost-effective manner too.
Right.
So ensuring the vulnerability scans are there, then you're working through your efforts to patch everything, address any kind of open ports, make sure you don't have any on your firewalls. That happens all too often. And then the penetration tests are key because it takes it that step further. Right. What kind of enumeration can happen? What can the tools exploit, or the manual pen tester? It helps you see man-in-the-middle attacks, which the vulnerability scans aren't going to give you.
Or if there's segmented subnets and VLANs and so forth, testing to make sure that segmentation is actually working.
Absolutely. I don't know how many times we come across organizations that have a guest network and a corporate network, and the guest network's open, so it's not secured. And then there is some sort of way in. It can still communicate to their internal network, so the segmentation is not there.
Right.
And those things absolutely need to be validated. So if a pen test isn't performed, you don't know that.
You don't know.
Yeah, you don't know that, and it is critical because you may not know that somebody's in your environment for months at that rate. So, and one thing I'll say is, there's manual penetration testing, which is great, but there's also some tools out there that can do automated virtual penetration tests, and those allow for a much more cost-effective manner of, hey, I want to check it every month. I want to stay ahead of the game, and then annually I'm going to bring in the pen testers to just do that validation, do their manual pen testing against my web apps, against my external, and see where I have risk.
You speak of web apps. Like, I've been doing a lot of reading on AI automation in organizations nowadays, especially since there's so many IT teams that are maybe understaffed and overworked, and maybe they can't quickly implement a workflow for an end user. And so a lot of employees within organizations are taking it upon themselves to utilize these AI automation tools to make their lives easier in order to complete and keep track of like the many tasks that they have. What are your thoughts on how that may or may not provide a risk to the organization, and how to basically have more visibility on what that looks like and some better security?
Yeah. I will say that I am by no means up to date on everything that AI is capable of.
Mm-hmm.
It does scare me quite a bit.
Really?
Not in the end of the world sort of fashion, more in the, to your point, people are using it to make their lives easier, which I think is great, and there's a place for that. And I think that AI can be very valuable when properly vetted and trained, because you got to train it for your environment or whatever the use case is, right? I think it can be very valuable to do those. I think of like a tier 1 help desk request, password resets, basic troubleshooting, or from a security perspective, helping to review and kind of rule out some of those false positive alerts, so that you can really focus on the ones that are potential indicators of compromise. So I see value in that, but generative AI has a long way to go, and I think we're so early to the game that it scares me to be on the bleeding edge of something like that. And and then subsequently you have organizations who are looking for, let's be real, people are looking for that easy button, right? Oh, this will make my life easier. Let me put that in place. Well, I don't know what kind of risk that introduces, and I think that just like with any new technology or system that you're going to allow access to your crown jewels in your environment, you have to properly, you have to do your due diligence to make sure that it's going to work for you, that it has the security posture and expectation that you would expect for your organization before you just let it go, So I don't know all the right answers around AI. I just know that it just like with anything, it needs to be rolled out properly and implemented properly. So there should be a significant testing period that comes with that to just validate. And the access, I mean, that's one thing that we've done for a lot of organizations, because they have concern from an IT perspective of, users going out to all the chat GPT sites and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So we've done what we can to block some of those sites so that those users can't access that, because who knows AI is pulling all the information from the internet, and it can be a very useful tool. It doesn't mean that everything's true or real that it's bringing in. And I don't know what's real on the internet as it is.
It reminds me when the first search engine came about, and when people were able to actually just search for any and everything and just quickly gain access to information. It's like, okay, it was on the internet, so it must be true.
Must be true. And now that's so much more true than anything, right? You hear something, and then somebody develops an opinion about it, and they take that opinion as fact, and it's just, I don't know that we can ever change that behavior, but it's absolutely the case where it's a trust but verify when that stuff comes over.
It's interesting, especially to think about how AI can be implemented, especially in a SOC environment, to basically quickly analyze threats that are detected, maybe making observation, maybe the analysts are working and training those AI models to effectively investigate and alert, and then from there having the second set of eyes to actually verify, hey, is this model working as intended?
Yes, I think that's huge. If you don't have that second set of eyes, then you have blind trust,
right? And
that's not where any of us want to be in the security space. So I agree. If you can properly train the tool to help you in that capacity, it can be invaluable.
I agree.
And then you have that SOC analyst that goes in, okay, yes, absolutely. And once you've done that enough, now you've trained the engine to, work on your behalf and really be a valuable part of the team, essentially, which would allow organizations to subsequently streamline their staff, potentially lower costs. But there still has, at least for the time being, there still has to be that human element that's doing what you just said. So,
you have any interesting stories, maybe with a customer? You don't have to say their names or anything like that, where they had an interesting story. Maybe they didn't have a process in place to assess their risk and vulnerabilities, and they ended up getting hit or breached or even compromised because of that. Mm-hmm. Maybe you were working with this customer to get them to that point, and it just so happened things took place or transpired unexpectedly.
Yeah. I think there's a number of them. One that's coming to mind right now is a customer that had come to us and they wanted to, bring our SIEM and SOC services on board. Saw that as kind of the silver bullet, right?
Right.
And so we're in the middle of an implementation. We're rolling out our agents and our software, and we haven't yet gotten our network sensors in place, and they got breached at that time. But it's because they didn't have any endpoint protection on their devices at that time.
Right.
So it was like, hey, we're crossing our fingers and nothing's going to happen until we get this software in place. And it was in process. The good thing was, since we were already engaged in process, we were able to get to it very quickly.
Nice.
But there was still a lot of cleanup to perform after that. And
there always is.
Always.
Yeah, there always is.
Always. So I hear about these sort of things all too often. Or just the other thing that I hear about, and this is a constant struggle that I would imagine that happens to a lot of organizations, is you've got the IT department or the information security department, and they don't have the buy-in from executive leadership or the board.
Right.
Often comes in play. And that's where they feel helpless at times. Hey, I've been telling them for years, but they don't want to spend money. IT doesn't need money, right? And so all too often, that's a story that we hear. And it's just some of those basic tools. Yeah. I have a customer that had multiple sites, and their primary site that they had servers sitting behind, they didn't have firewall. They had a router, great. Yeah. So they had no protection for anything coming into their network. And so obviously that was the first thing that we helped them put in place. But it's just those basic things. And all too often I see, especially with smaller organizations,
right,
you've got people that are not IT people, they don't have that background, and they're running the IT department.
Yeah.
Those are the organizations that I feel, if they can get a good partner to support them and provide them the consulting and services they need without gouging them, right? You know, knowing that they don't need everything under the sun, but they do need some level of protection, some level of monitoring on a regular basis, because that monitoring is key. If you're not monitoring 24/7, then things happen in the middle of the night, on the weekend, nobody's looking at it, and you know, a lot can happen in 36 hours.
It's interesting because we cross paths with quite a few different organizations or members from IT teams that work in organizations that maybe they don't come from, I guess, a seasoned background in IT. And so they're figuring it out as they go.
Yes.
And then trying to also receive that support from higher ups in order to convince them, hey, we are in need of this. I believe we're in need of this, but the higher ups aren't willing to make those decisions in order to spend or open up that budget to make sure that the security is taken a bit more serious, especially in smaller organizations.
Yeah.
How would you go about, I guess, walking through with someone who's in that position in order to help assist them with bringing that information or bringing an overview to their higher ups to make those decisions?
I love that question because there's so many organizations that are in that place. And I think one of the big things that there's a gap with is the ability for that individual or that IT department to effectively communicate to the board what their risk and what their exposure is.
Right.
The risk to their business reputation, the risk of downtime, those sort of things. And so, you know, first I'd want to understand in talking to that individual, okay, so how do you operate? What does your approval process look like? What are your biggest pain points that you see?
Yeah.
And oftentimes the way that we've helped organizations in that capacity when we're just getting engaged is to do some sort of an assessment. And we even do assessments at times that we call workshops, where it's very high level. We don't get in and we're not scanning anything or pen testing, but it's much more of a dialogue and a conversation around compliance, governance, security controls. What do they have in place today? And the goal of that conversation is to understand what they have, what they're doing well, and the areas that they have opportunity, so that we could effectively communicate to their board. And so whether it be that workshop or that assessment, being able to go through that, and then I would advocate to put a CISO type resource with that individual and say, hey, let's meet with your board and let's let that individual help walk you through that conversation so that they can be your advocate and help convey what risk you have. And if you don't take these steps, hey, you're just going on faith that nothing's going to happen.
I'm glad you brought that up because our chief information security officer, Jonathan Kemet, he pretty much works with organizations, providing them with tabletop exercises similar to what you're explaining. And there's so much value that comes from that because you can get all the members from that board in one room, provide them with a scenario, walk them through the entire storyline to see how they respond. But then it also hits home because it's pretty much putting them in the mindset, hey, this is our organization. This is how we would respond. And then for them all that light moment to hit them right at the same time. It's like, oh, there's a gap there. We should probably address that.
Yeah, and I think some organizations, if they haven't gone through a tabletop or been in that scenario, or forbid an actual breach, right? They don't have the understanding of just how painful it is, but also how fast it feels like everything's moving in that moment. So if you haven't gone through that process and really trained your team and documented what needs to happen, you're going off tribal knowledge, and people forget things, or people, things happen to people, right? That person's not available today. They were on vacation. They're out of the country. You can't get a hold of them, what have you, or something worse. But I agree, going through those exercises, that's where we've seen the most growth with organizations, and I know this is something, like you said, that Jonathan focuses on, it really comes down to putting those processes in place and then training those team members, and it's multiple departments depending on the organization, to make sure that you've got the key people who understand what decisions need to be made, when they need to be made.
Right.
How do you communicate with the media? How do you communicate with your team? When do we say, hey, we're declaring a disaster and we need to go do X, Y, Z? It's so pivotal to practice those things. We practice everything else in our lives. Why wouldn't we practice that?
Exactly. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to sit and chat with me, Bryan. This was a great conversation. Is there anything that you would like to share before we conclude in this episode of Secure AF?
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I think Jonathan actually said this. So one of the things I was listening to when it was one of your guys' podcasts, was he said he was talking to a CISO at one point in time who knew they had an issue, knew they had gaps, but didn't press the issue because leadership didn't want to hear what they had to say or make an organizational change. Maybe it came down to he didn't want to be disliked in the organization. I'm not really sure.
Right.
But
which I feel happens more often than not.
Too often.
Yeah.
Too often, because you're right. You have the people potentially that are making decisions, and that's not their focus. Their focus is driving revenue, which I get it, but you can't drive revenue if you're down, if you're breached, if your business reputation takes that hit, and now you have organizations that don't want to do business with you. You're losing customers. You're bleeding out on the table, essentially. And so I love that Jonathan brought that up, and none of us should be shy about that, because no organization wants to be in that situation.
Absolutely.
If you tell a CEO, hey, you're going to be breached tomorrow if we don't do these things, and they don't listen to you, I don't know that you won't even be working there, to be honest with you, because who's going to lose their job when something happens? It's the CISO who didn't press that issue. And so I don't want to see organizations feel like they're on an island and there's no valuable solutions out there. It doesn't need to be, hey, I need to invest $100,000 right now to get me where I need to be. There are fixes and solutions that they're not the easy button. They're not, a silver bullet, but if you can put the right processes, tools, and people in place, and that could be outsourced from someone like an Armorpoint or an Alias or what have you, if you do that and you continue to drive on that roadmap, I mean, good things are going to happen. And it's not, what is the saying? It's not if or when you'll be breached, right? So then it's a matter of how prepared are you going to be? What kind of tools, processes do you have in place so that when that happens, you can mitigate it as much as possible and allow your organization to get back to doing business. So
I appreciate you sharing that, man.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Yeah.